Thank you, Anne-Marie. I should say I have been busy since I've been here. The one thing I would say that is quite striking to me, you're training students who will be both. Idea people, but people who then know how to act on their ideas. Frequently when you're in the government, you find people who have ideas, but have no clue as to how to act on them. Others who know only how to act, but they have to be told what to act on. So the idea that you will train people who can be both conceptual but practical is an important mission, and it clearly is a mission of the Woodrow Wilson School, and it's a pleasure to be here from that standpoint. Secondly, I should note that a lot of people have asked me over time, well, how is it possible that you could serve at senior political appointee positions in both Republican and Democratic administrations? And I've said, well, consider my training. I mean, who did I spend a lot of time dealing with? Arabs and Israelis. So if I could handle them, was it inconceivable I could handle Republicans and Democrats? It shouldn't have been. I'm hoping, we're seeing it already, I think, with the Obama administration as it begins to emerge, we're seeing maybe the tradition of working in Republican and Democratic administrations alike is now accepted again. We had a tradition in this country that politics should stop at the water's edge. You want to hear me, too? No? Can't hear? You can't hear?
I think it's okay. We don't know. This is the lamp.
Oh, well, well, I want to shine a light on things. That's okay. All right. You hear me? Everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay? All right. Want me to start over? No, I'm kidding. All right, in conclusion. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to talk tonight about the Middle East. And the title was sort of Whither the Middle East. But what I want to do is I want to offer you a perspective on the Middle East. And I'm not going to talk about the whole Middle East, but you're going to find that I will end up talking about Iraq, Iran, and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So that's going to be a major part of the Middle East. But I want to start by offering a story because it's about leverage. And when it comes to negotiations or when you're dealing in the Middle East, if you don't have leverage, you probably shouldn't come to the party. And this is a story of a man who actually, he had a parrot. And the parrot, if you'll pardon the expression, was a foul-mouthed bird. And this was a bird that basically would constantly use swear words. And he tried everything. He got a trainer. It didn't work. He tried rewards, he tried punishments, it didn't work. Finally, one day he came home, and the bird was just on a roll, was using four-letter words, went on for 10 minutes and didn't repeat himself. And the man had it. So he grabbed the parrot by the neck, shook it, and put it in the freezer. And I felt bad after a little bit, so he opens the freezer, and out the parrot comes, and the parrot has been transformed. And the parrot says, I really apologize. I'm so sorry. I promise you I will never, ever use a bad word again. You have my sincere and profound and honest apology and regrets for what I've done. Well, the man's pretty impressed, and he's about to think about what their new life is going to be, and then the parrot says, I do have one question. What did the chicken do? Now that's leverage. And in the Middle East, you better have leverage. When you look at where we are, if I'm going to offer a perspective of how to think about the area, maybe the best way to do it is to say, when the best case we have is Iraq, you know we're in trouble? I mean, think about it. Right now, if you look at the region, we're probably doing better in Iraq than any place else. Now, even there, let's understand what's going on. What's going on in Iraq is that we have a security situation that has been dramatically transformed for the better. On an average, we used to have 24 violent incidents a day in Baghdad, now we have 4. We still have 4. I mean, it's still a place that has violence, but the circumstances, the role of the Iraqi army, the overall environment has changed dramatically for the better. Now that's the good news. Bear in mind, what was the surge supposed to do? The surge was supposed to create a secure enough environment so that the leaders of the different sectarian groups would feel confident enough, safe enough, to be able to forge political understandings and, in effect, produce a new political compact for Iraq. Well, we have a more secure environment. We don't have a new political compact for Iraq. We still have basic divides. We may have a government that is operating, at least in the security realm, more effectively. But when it comes to the Sunni-Shia divide, those who are in the awakening councils, who make up about 100 to 110,000 people, they're also called the Sons of Iraq, those who are in those awakening councils were promised that they would be integrated into the security forces, which they have not been. They were promised that those who weren't integrated into the security forces would be found jobs, which has also not taken place. The good news is that they're being paid. We were paying all of them. We were paying $300 a month to the rank and file and $450 a month to the leaders. We're still paying about half of them, but the Iraqi government has begun to pay them. So there is an evolution, a transition taking place, but the basic political divide between them hasn't been overcome. Those in the awakening councils have extremely high expectations right now. There are going to be provincial elections held January 31st. They believe that the elections will be the vehicle for them to get an institutionalized piece of the pie. This is the way, once they're elected, they will become, in a sense, a formal part of the structure. And that structure will ensure they have budgets, they're able to manage their own affairs. Everything is based on a premise. It's based on an assumption that these elections will go the way they expect. Well, we better hope they go the way they expect, but it's not a given. So one thing to be watching for come early next year is what happens with the elections. The Kurds and the government also have problems now. The Kurds are looking at the creation by the Maliki government of tribal councils as a way to contain them, as a way to limit what it is they seek. So from their standpoint, how the question of tribal councils is addressed, how the issue of Kirkuk is addressed, is fundamental to how they see themselves behaving in the future. By the way, the Kurds would like to see an American presence in perpetuity. So that's not where the government is. Obviously, we have a status of forces agreement that was reached. It's not where the government is. Even some of those within the Shia community, leaving aside the Jaish al-Mahdi, leaving aside Muqtada al-Sadr, those who have been allies with Prime Minister Maliki, people who are the leaders of the Islamic Supreme Council, they too look at the creation of the tribal councils as a competition with them. So there are lots of questions that have to be sorted out, and they're going to take place in a context where we're going to withdraw. You know, I used to say during the campaign, even though I was out campaigning for the now president-elect, that whoever was elected, there was going to be a withdrawal in Iraq. Well, now we know. Quite apart from what the president-elect has already committed himself to, there's a status of force agreement that says by June of this year, we will be out of the cities. And by 2011, we'll be out completely. When Senator Obama was running as a candidate, and even now when he talks about 16 months, he talked about 16 months related to all combat forces, not all forces. Well, the status of forces agreement says all American forces in 3 years. We're going to have a withdrawal in Iraq. The question is, how is that withdrawal managed? And how does it relate to trying to create a political context that produces long-term stability in a roughly representative Iraq? This is still an open question. It's going to challenge the new administration. It's going to have to think about how to use the withdrawal so that it has a maximum political effect. You know, we had a military surge. We've never had a diplomatic surge with all the neighbors. And yet, every single one of Iraq's neighbors, including Iran, every single one of Iraq's neighbors, whether it's Iran or it's Saudi Arabia or it's Jordan or it's Turkey or it's Syria, all of them want to ensure that Iraq doesn't fall apart. None of them wants a vacuum within Iraq. Well, the fact that none of them wants a vacuum, none of them wants to be sucked into an endless, expensive competition, that gives us a certain leverage. I'm going to keep coming back to the theme. Now, you know, one way to come back to the theme is I can just refer to the parrot and the chicken, or I can use the term leverage. But with their desire not to have an endless, expensive competition, gives us some leverage to affect their behavior and how it might apply to what goes on within Iraq. Our use of withdrawal also as a lever with the different Iraqi players internally should also be something that we think through. It's going to be complicated, it's not going to be simple, but the fact is we're now on a trajectory. And we can see what it is. The question is, can we use the withdrawal in a way that produces the outcome that we want? One way or the other, there's going to be withdrawal. The question is, do we maximize how we employ it? Now, when we look at Iraq, I made a reference to Iran. I said that Iran doesn't want to see a vacuum. I can tell you that Iran doesn't want to see a fragmentation of Iraq. Why? Because it's a terrible precedent for them. Iran is 50% Persian. You know what that means? It means it's 50% not Persian. It means there's a lot of different groups there. There are Kurds, there are Arabs, there are Baluch. You know, you are dealing with a country that if Iraq were to fall apart, it has potentially a precedent for Iran. So they have big interests in Iraq. They are trying to insinuate themselves in Iraq for the long haul. The truth is, everywhere we look in the region, we are seeing ourselves in a competition with Iran. And by the way, they define it that way. You may not recall, but back in May, when the Lebanese government discovered that there was a Hezbollah telecommunications fiber optic network that had been created completely without the knowledge of the Lebanese government, they sought to assert their sovereignty over that network, and the Hezbollah said, no way. And not only did they say no way, when the government also tried to replace the security official at the airport who was turning a blind eye to a lot of the smuggling that was taking place for Hezbollah, not only did they say no way, but they then engaged in a confrontation, a military confrontation with the Lebanese government, surrounded the Prime Minister's house. Lebanese army sat on the sidelines, and the government was forced to back down. At the time this was going on, if you read the Iranian media, it was filled with stories and commentary on what was going on in Lebanon. And the essence of what they said was, by the way, to the region. They were targeting their commentary to the region. And they were saying what is happening in Lebanon is a struggle, a competition between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States. And their message to the region was pay attention to its outcome. And they described Hezbollah as being an appendage. These are their words, not mine. An appendage of the Islamic Republic. The Iranians see themselves in a competition everywhere. We see them also in competition with us in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and they are exercising a kind of coercion. The commentary I was describing was one message, one form of it, but there are others. I was recently talking to an Arab ambassador, and he said to me, the Iranians are going around the region, and they're saying, you want to be a friend of the United States? You think it's good to be a friend of the United States? Look what happened to Sinora, the Lebanese prime minister. Did it serve him well? Look what happened to Saakashvili. Did it serve him well? We're going to be here. Where's the United States going to be? Now, this is the way they deal with the region. And imagine how they will deal with the region if they have nuclear weapons. They use coercion now. Imagine the kind of leverage they would have if they had nuclear weapons, which would provide them a shield behind which to engage in greater coercion and subversion. We are dealing in a situation with the Iranians now where the region is now this kind of competitive landscape. They are moving every day towards acquiring a nuclear capability. The IAEA has now reported that they have stockpiled 630 kilos of low-enriched uranium. What they've said is that if you purified that to enrich it further, that they would have enough already for the core of one nuclear bomb. So every day that they add to the enriched uranium, the stockpile they have, the closer they get to becoming a nuclear weapon state. You could say they're already a nuclear power because they're already stockpiling low-enriched uranium. They're not a nuclear weapon state, and they're not yet at that point. But the fact is, when the Obama administration comes in, it's going to face a reality where it has less time and fewer options available to head it off. When you think about it, we're in a situation where what you don't want to see happen is that the only two choices we have for dealing with the Iranians is either to live with an Iran with nuclear weapons because that will change the landscape as we know it, or to have to use force against Iran to prevent them from going to having nuclear weapons. In either case, those are two very uninviting outcomes. When you have two really uninviting outcomes, you know what you do? You come up with a third way. Because if we stay on the path we're on, that's the choice we're going to face, and in the not too distant future. And if we don't want to face that choice, we better change the dynamic. So how to change the dynamic, number one. Number two, can we? Is there a way to head the Iranians off? And here what I'm going to do, since Anne-Marie showed the book, I can't resist, I'm going to talk a little bit about statecraft and how you would apply a statecraft model to trying to change Iranian behavior. Now, the objective is to prevent them from going nuclear. Now, when we take a step back, again, statecraft always starts with what's your objective? And then you have to focus on what are the means I have available. You have to focus as well on what are the vulnerabilities of the side whose behavior I want to change. That's what leverage is all about. How you apply leverage in a situation to potential vulnerabilities so that those whose behavior you want to change are able to change. Sometimes you have the means on your own to do it. Sometimes you have to mobilize others who might share the same objective as you to join with you so that you maximize your collective means to change their behavior. So let's look at Iran. If we're going to change their behavior, we know what their objective is right now. They'd like to basically create facts. But our objective is to prevent it. And beyond wanting to prevent it, we have to take account of what vulnerabilities do the Iranians have that give us a reason to think that we could change their behavior. And once we've identified that, then how do we marshal our various assets to apply it? All right, so what are the Iranian vulnerabilities? Well, number one, right now the Iranian economy is in terrible shape. Now, the truth be told, it was in terrible shape before the financial meltdown. Before the financial meltdown, the Iranians had, according to their central bank, a 29.4% inflation rate. Now, in my experience, I have to tell you, when a country like Iran admits to an inflation rate of 29.4%, multiply by 5, and you get a closer approximation of what their real inflation rate is. The fact that the inflation is a big political issue is indicated by not just the criticism of the President Ahmadinejad, but the fact that the Supreme Leader, which is a nice title, the fact that the Supreme Leader himself has talked about inflation, which I can assure you has not been on the forefront of his preoccupations historically. So number one, very high inflation. Number two, very high unemployment, probably over 30%. Number three, they get the vast bulk, about 85%, between 80 and 85% of the government's revenues which they use to buy off the public with subsidies, comes from their export of oil. Now, their oil output is dropping, their internal consumption is rising, and I don't have to tell you what's happened to the price of oil. They began to program their budgets based on a set of assumptions about very high-priced oil. You know, I've seen different kinds of statements on their part saying that they need $70 a barrel of oil to balance their budget. I think they got used to $100 a barrel of oil. And now we're at, what, $42 a barrel? So they're going to have huge deficits. It's going to be harder and harder for them to basically sustain their subsidies. When they have had to cut back subsidies, they've seen reactions to it. When they went to rationing of gasoline, because they import 43% of their gasoline, 12 gas stations in Tehran were burned down. When they wanted to provide a value-added tax to the Bazari class, which has always been a backbone of the regime, they went on strike, and the government backed off. Now, what it reveals is when there is a reaction from the public, they back off. It means they're highly sensitive to that. So what you're looking at in Iran is profound economic vulnerabilities, dependency on gasoline being imported from the outside, as I said, 43% because they don't have the refinery capacity, huge inflation, and a situation where they don't have the money now to provide the kind of subsidies that they did before. And the difficulty here is not only when they don't have the subsidies, it triggers potential reactions, But also, there's now open criticism that they've squandered most of their reserves. 2 weeks ago, I saw a story that said that the Iranian reserves were down to anywhere between $9 and $20 billion, which is remarkably low given where they had been. And there was a criticism offered by Hassan Rouhani, who at one point was the secretary of their Security Council and was at one time one of their negotiators on the nuclear issue, attacking Ahmadinejad and saying, you've squandered all our reserves. And he even referred to the Saudis having a huge war chest, which, by the way, happens to be true. So all this suggests that they have vulnerabilities and they're aware of their vulnerabilities. Now the question is, how do you take advantage of that? Up until now, we've had a policy that was the marriage of weak sticks and weak carrots. Now I know that shocks you, but that policy didn't work. The sticks weren't profound enough, the penalties weren't profound enough to be able to concentrate the Iranian mind, and the carrots weren't worth enough to give them a different way to think about it. What you really need to do is you need to create strong sticks and strong carrots. Now, it has to be a combination of both for a reason. If we do only strong sticks, the net effect on the Iranians will be this is about regime change. And if it's about regime change, well, then they hunker down, get nuclear weapons as fast as you can because that's going to protect your regime. If it's only strong carrots or only strong inducements, there's no combination of inducements that are worth as much to the Iranians as having nuclear weapons. You're not going to induce them out of giving this up. So you have to have a marriage of both. The sticks to concentrate the mind, the carrots to offer a pathway out. Both have to be significant. Now, can we do that? Well, we clearly can't do it on our own. And this is the whole idea. If your means on your own aren't sufficient, then you're going to have to mobilize others. We haven't been able to do that up to now. The readiness to engage Iran, actually, meaning directly, gives you a basis on which to draw others in. Europeans, at this point, are still providing. The EU has cut back on their credit guarantees for the companies doing business within Iran, but they still provide several billions of euros in terms of credit guarantees for their companies to invest in Iran. If you're trying to convince the Iranians that if they continue down this pathway, they're going to pay a severe price, you want to convince them the economic lifeline is going to be cut. Well, pretty hard to convince them of that if the EU, which is our partner, is still providing credit guarantees to their own companies to do business there. Now, one of the reasons the Europeans have been hesitant to apply greater economic sanctions is because they say every time we take a step in that direction, the Chinese fill our place. Now, there's a second reason they've been reluctant. The second reason is they have feared that every step in this direction, absent our talking to the Iranians, meaning the U.S., creates a slippery slope to confrontation. So you have to have a strategy that deals with both those concerns. Our engagement directly with Iran deals with the concern of a slippery slope to confrontation. Now, how do we deal with the European concern that, in fact, if they take a step, the Chinese will simply fill it? First, it's a legitimate concern because the Chinese have been doing that. So what do? Well, here again, we've got to think about who has potential leverage on the Chinese. Well, I'll give you an example. How about Saudi Arabia? The Chinese get 13% of their oil from Iran, but their stakes in Saudi Arabia absolutely dwarf their stakes in Iran. Saudi Arabia today is filling the Saudi strategic. Saudi Arabia today is filling the Chinese strategic petroleum reserve in China. So Saudi oil is going to fill the strategic petroleum reserve in China. The Chinese have massive investments in the Saudi petrochemical industry. And the two of them have been, over the last year, engaging very significantly in building joint refineries around the world. If you compare the stakes that China has in Saudi Arabia to its stakes in Iran, they don't compare. Now, the Saudis have financial clout. So if we were thinking in a statecraft way, we'd think, how can we integrate Saudi financial clout into a strategy of applying greater economic pressure or leverage on Iran? They have a need. The Saudis do not want Iran to go nuclear because an Iran with nuclear weapons has a nuclear shield behind which to engage in coercion and subversion. And who do you think their first target's going to be? The Shia population in Saudi Arabia is about 15%, and guess where it's located? In the eastern province where most of the oil is. So The Saudis don't want this to be the case. So one of the things we have to do is we have to construct a strategy where we give the Saudis a reason to want to join this. Now, we don't have to create the reason. They have the stake. You could ask the question, well, why haven't they already done it? They have a stake in Iran not going nuclear. Why haven't they at this point already been a part of such a strategy? When you ask the Saudis now, they'll say, because we don't know what your position is if we do it. And when we do it, that will provoke the Iranians. Now, if that's a genuine argument, well, then you're going to have to sit down with them and go through how you address the concerns they have. If it's an excuse, then a lot of foreign policy is about denying excuses. In any case, the Saudis could be an interesting pivot in a strategy designed to build pressure and leverage on Iran. If we're going to affect the Chinese, if we're going to affect the Europeans, if we're going to bring the Saudis in, suddenly we can create a set of economic pressures that can concentrate the Iranian mind. But the fact that we're talking to Iran at the same time is what also gives the Iranians a sense that, all right, there could be a way out. You have to do this in a way that doesn't convince the Iranians that the output is one that leaves them humiliated, because they won't accept that even if they're under pressure, and yet at the same time is something that basically answers our need. We want an outcome where Iran forgoes its nuclear development. The Iranians have a right under the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to have civil nuclear power. They have that right. They will constantly talk about their right. There they happen to be correct. Of course, what they neglect to say is they have an obligation and responsibility under the NPT that they have to reveal all their nuclear-related activities, which they have not done. So they have a right, but they also have responsibilities. We need to begin to talk about the Iranian rights so they understand those can be addressed, but we also need to talk about the responsibilities. Whether we can produce an outcome, I don't know, but I can tell you that if we stay on the path we're on, we know what it's going to lead to. What I'm suggesting to you is there is a way through engagement to deal directly with the Iranians on the one hand, to show them there's a way out, but also to build the pressure. And it means operating in a way where you don't depend on the Security Council. We've already got what we need from the Security Council. You focus on those who actually have the real means to apply pressure to the Iranians. All right, what about the Israeli-Palestinian issue? You'd like to keep talking about the Iranian issue, but if I concluded and I just went to Q&A, I'd probably go through withdrawal, and you don't want to see that because I always have to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. All right, look, let's take, again, a step back and take a look at where we are. Over dinner, actually, I was asked by one of the students, why is it in the year 2000 we were very close to achieving an agreement? And why is it that we couldn't simply take that reality and apply it now? And it's a good question. One of the things you have to understand, again, when you're conducting diplomacy or statecraft is you always have to pay attention to the context that you're in. The context will affect what's possible. It will affect your objective. It will affect the choices you have available for dealing with your objective. In the case of the Israelis and Palestinians, the reality today is that they both disbelieve. Why do they disbelieve? In the case of the Israelis, the disbelief is a function of two different withdrawals. They withdrew from Lebanon unilaterally. Hezbollah became dramatically stronger. In the summer of 2006, they got 4,000 rockets for their trouble. They withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Hamas ended up taking over Gaza, and not for one day, until there was a ceasefire, which is now basically framed, not for one day did the rocket or mortar fire cease. So Israel got out of Gaza, but it didn't stop. The Israeli public says, why wouldn't the same thing happen if we got out of the West Bank? With the difference being Gaza lies along the periphery of Israel. The West Bank sits astride Israel. Rockets from the West Bank into Israel would make every single Israeli community vulnerable. You couldn't fly to Ben Gurion or out of it. You would have to be shut down if you had daily rocket fire out of the West Bank. So the Israeli public says, why would we put ourselves in that kind of a position? So they disbelieve. The Palestinians have a mirror image, not because of the same sources, but they have a mirror image of disbelief. Why? From their standpoint, they say the Israelis have complete control over our movement. They have made it almost impossible to have an effective functioning economy because of limitations on movement, the way commerce can operate. We don't think the Israelis will ever surrender control. So they look at the Israelis and they say, Israel will never surrender control. Any effort to negotiate peace is fruitless. The Israelis look at the Palestinians and say, either they can't or they won't do what is necessary, and the West Bank will become Gaza, and then every Israeli will be having to live under shelters. We're not going to let that happen. That's the context for peacemaking today between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, is it impossible to deal with? No. But you're going to have to fashion a strategy that takes account of that. You're going to have to fashion a strategy that creates a foundation for peacemaking. So what does one do? Well, I'm going to offer you 5 different levels of what has to happen, just because I like the number, and it's good. And first level is psychology. We have to change the psychology. When you have disbelief, when the two sides have gone from believing, which they did, there was a point in which they believed. When you go from belief to disbelief, this isn't a loss of confidence. A loss of confidence is something you can correct. A loss of belief is profound. It's deep. It's basic. This is not something that you hit the light switch and suddenly you have it again. So your objective is to affect the psychology. And when you're affecting the psychology, what are you trying to do? You're trying to give each public a reason to take a second look. They won't believe all over again, but you want them to pause and take a second look and think about possibilities again. Now, we, in a sense, in my mind, we squandered the Annapolis Conference. The Annapolis Conference, if we were going to put it together, should have been based on having a day-after strategy, so once you got everybody's attention, the conference with 50 nations coming, it focused everyone's attention. Something had to change after it, and it didn't. So we lost that moment. Now we have to find a way to create a new reason to take a second look. And I would suggest the first level requires the following. We need a particular set of steps where each public will look at the other side and say, something's happening. They'll take note of it. Now the trick is going to be, how do you get each side to do something that they politically can do that would be meaningful to the other side's public? So let me suggest a couple of examples. In the case of the Israelis, if the Israelis saw dramatic steps on security, that would make a big difference. Truth be told, there are steps being taken now by the Palestinians. They are, with our help, they are professionalizing their security capability on the West Bank. They're now reestablishing law and order. They're even, in some cases, moving against Hamas activists. If you ask the Israelis, are they dealing with the hardcore, the answer is they're not. It isn't to say that they think that someday, meaning the Israeli military, will say they are not. Doesn't mean at some point they may not, but this is a process. So if you set a standard that's too high for the Palestinians and they can't meet it, you're not going to convince the Israeli public about what is being done. I would focus less on the security, on the psychological realm, and more on the issue of incitement. This is something the Palestinians actually can do. If there was an unmistakable policy from the Palestinian Authority against incitement in the schools, in the mosques, in the media, and it was a daily refrain, the Israeli public would notice that. They would say something has changed. Now, what about on the Palestinian side? Well, the things that would affect the Palestinians the most would be movement or settlement activity. Now, here again, can you get the Israelis to do the things that would matter most to the Palestinians? Well, if you could, it would be great. My guess is you can't do it quite the way you might most want to, just like you can't get everything you'd want from the Palestinians right now on security. So what would I do? Well, I would focus on movement, but I wouldn't focus on movement from the standpoint of I'm going to go lift checkpoints. Because you lift checkpoints and bombs go off in Israel, the game is over. What I would do, though, is I'd focus on how to make movement through checkpoints dramatically more efficient. And I'll give you an example. If you go to a place like Calandia, which is in East Jerusalem connected to the West Bank, you go there and you'll find there are 5 lanes, and one is open. Now, if you could ensure that all 5 lanes were open, guess what? Israel makes no sacrifice in terms of security. But Palestinians, if it took 1/5 the time to get through there, they'd notice that. What about on commerce? Because again, this affects the economic well-being, but it also affects the psychology. What if you could create an easy pass for the checkpoints? And this might apply to people as well. You could create a set of criteria. You know, in various factories, there would be cameras there could be GPS on the trucks. You could develop the criteria with the Israelis over what would satisfy them. And by the way, this could be done. And anyone who met that criteria, whether it's a business or it's individuals, they get an easy pass. And they go through. Well, guess what? Palestinians would notice that because it affects their daily life. You know, if it becomes far more predictable how long it takes to get your kids to school, or if you have to go to the hospital, it's far more predictable, well, they'd notice that. So these are examples. I mean, I can develop more, but I'm giving you illustrative examples of if you're operating at a psychological level, what could you do that is, in fact, politically feasible for each side? I'm not asking them to do what they can't do, but I'm asking them to do what they can do that would be noticed by the other side. So that's level number one, the psychology, how to affect it. Level number two, we do have to affect the economics on the Palestinian side beyond just the commerce I was describing. Now, the fact of the matter is there has been an improvement. At the macro level, there's been an improvement, but it's not measured in ways that Palestinians feel because it's not affecting employment. The donors have provided about $1 billion over the last year to the Palestinian Authority, which has been used to pay the salaries of the Palestinian Authority, which is the largest employer in the West Bank, but it still means you still have about 30% unemployment, and plus probably another 15-20% underemployment. But in addition to that, in addition to the whole issue of the limitation in terms of employment, the Palestinian Authority has been using the money to pay down debt, so this means they become a better credit risk. Again, it makes sense, but it doesn't trickle down. It doesn't affect the Palestinian public. You got to put people back to work, and what I would try to do is I would do something that is labor intensive, and I would focus very heavily on housing and infrastructure. Now, you have to bear in mind that the Palestinians were the backbone of the Israeli construction industry before they couldn't go and work in Israel any longer. So they have the skills, they have the capability. In 2002, the then leader of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed, gave the Palestinian Authority $55 million to build Sheikh Zayed city in Gaza. The Palestinians did the architecture, they did the contracting, they did all the labor. Now, what if you had 10 massive housing projects for the West Bank? What if you created a $1 billion financing fund from the Gulf states? I'll grant that they're not nearly as flush as they were, but $1 billion for them at this point as a collective. I mean, you're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar. If they provided a $1 billion financing fund for construction of housing and infrastructure, the impact on job creation would be dramatic. And you want to create an economic floor that hasn't been there. You want Palestinians in the West Bank, and by the way, this is one of the ways you contrast the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank with Hamas in Gaza. You want there to be a sense that the Palestinian Authority is actually beginning to deliver. The psychology is designed to change the climate. The economics are designed to show that the Palestinian Authority is beginning to deliver, which builds its credibility. So that's the second level. The third level, security. As I said, there's a couple different ways, I didn't say what I'm about to say, there's a couple different ways to restore confidence on the security front, but I have to explain why there's such a profound problem. There is an enormous conceptual gap between where the Israelis are in security and where the Palestinians are in security. They have each learned completely different lessons from the last 8 years. 8 years ago, when I was negotiating with the Israelis on what a Palestinian state would look like and what the Israeli security requirements would be, I can tell you in the list of the top 20 requirements that the Israelis had, short-range rockets weren't there. Well, where do you think they'd be today? After Gaza, after Lebanon? This would be item number one. What's the conclusion the Israelis have drawn? The conclusion they've drawn is they have to have complete control over access into and out of the West Bank, and they have to have freedom of movement within it to guarantee not just that it isn't used as a platform for terror, but it's not used as a platform for launching rockets. Even now, when the Palestinian security forces are becoming much more active, they're in Jenin, in Ramallah, in Nablus, and even now in Hebron. Even now, the Israelis still go in on a very regular basis, not quite nightly, but a very regular basis, and they break up cells. Even now. And from their standpoint, they have to do that to ensure there aren't going to be rockets that will be fired into Israel. So that's the lesson the Israelis draw. We have to control access, and we have to be in a position where we have freedom of movement and freedom of action. What's the conclusion the Palestinians drew? The conclusion they drew from the last 8 years is if there's even one Israeli soldier here, we don't have independence. So they say no Israeli soldiers, you can have international forces. Any international forces you want, but no Israeli soldiers. At a certain level it might sound good, except we supposedly have a very vigorous UNIFIL that now has 15,000 troops in southern Lebanon. They were supposed to ensure that Hezbollah would not rebuild itself, and guess what? At the end of the war in 2006, Hezbollah had 10,000 rockets. Anybody know how many they have right now? 42,000. Now, since 2006. So from the Israeli standpoint, if you're going to persuade the Israelis, well, yeah, you can count on the international forces, they're going to say, I don't think so. So we have a conceptual gap. Now, how do you bridge that conceptual gap? There are two different ways to do it. One way is by building models of success on the ground. So the Israelis have a reason to begin to see that the Palestinians actually are doing what they say they will do. Because there's a legacy in security that they don't do what they say they will do. Now, we are beginning to see that, but it's clearly a long process. There's something else that has to happen. We have to bring the leaders of the Israeli military, the IDF, and the head of the Palestinian security forces together to create a common plan for the West Bank. A common security plan, including a sequence for how it would be acted. There has to be that kind of a discussion where there's a mutual stake in that plan. And where you have the capacity to judge, well, are they doing what they say they're going to do or not? It's one way to restore the Israeli relationship with the Palestinian security forces, which basically broke after the Intifada. The Israeli military felt burned, and they didn't want to deal with the Palestinian security forces. What's happening right now with the efforts that are being made at the local level, you are beginning to see a relationship at lower levels between the Israeli military and in a sense, those who are the brigade people for the Palestinians. And that's good. You actually have Israeli military beginning to say they're seeing a professional elan begin to emerge among the Palestinian security forces, but you don't have a plan for the whole West Bank. It hasn't been worked out by the two of them. There isn't a common stake in it. And if you don't build that kind of relationship, it's going to be very hard to overcome the conceptual divide. If it's going to continue to be just focused only on the local levels without a larger plan, I don't see how you build the bridges that you need to. But you can if you work at both levels. So that's the security level. Now the fourth level. This is what I call the Arab level. Something has changed in the region pretty dramatically from 8 years ago. And it's not just what I was saying in terms of the rockets and the missiles. The Palestinian Authority today, first of all, is split. Hamas controls Gaza. The Palestinian Authority overall is weaker. If you go back to the year 2000, you could like Arafat, dislike Arafat, but Arafat had the authority to make a decision. That he chose not to is one thing, but he had the authority to do it. You need to find a way not only to invest economically in the Palestinian Authority, you need to invest politically in that. It can't be done by us. We need the Arab world. We need the Arab world to assume a responsibility in peacemaking that has not been the norm in the past. We need them to invest in the Palestinian Authority and give it greater weight and authority, greater credibility, greater legitimacy, greater confidence. When it comes to dealing with the core issues of the conflict, they can make compromises because the Arab world embraces those compromises. So we need the Arab world to do that. But we also need the Arab world to embrace the Israelis. The Arab Peace Initiative is an important initiative that has been adopted by the Arab League, first adopted in 2002 and then reaffirmed in 2007. It is important because it represents a response to the Iranian narrative. The Iranian narrative is you don't have to accept peace. You don't have to accept Israel. And the Arab Peace Initiative says, no, we're prepared for full diplomatic relations after the Israelis have withdrawn to June 467, Jerusalem's the capital, and there's a just and agreed settlement to the refugee issue. Now, the Israelis haven't prepared to engage on it because they say, well, look, there's a lot of details there that need to be worked out. Truth be told, if we could get the Arab world to begin to give operational, practical content to the Arab Initiative, that would give you something to work with. What you're really looking for is the Arab world to reach out to Israel. Because at a time when the Israelis are disbelieving, if the Arab world demonstrates an outreach to the Israelis that shows how the region itself is changing, especially given concerns about Iran, then that actually probably creates a whole different basis on which the Israelis can act. And there is an Iranian dimension that I obviously just touched on. it has a big effect on this because, on the one hand, the Iranians appeal over the heads of Arab regimes to their streets and exploit the Palestinian issue. And on the other hand, if in fact you actually have the Arabs think about taking any steps towards the Israelis, then they're worried about what the Iranian response is going to be. So what we have to do, one of our challenges, and it gets back to what I was saying with regard to the Saudis on Iran, we have to have a strategic discussion with the Saudis and others that puts this issue and all the issues on the table so that we can establish priorities and they get a sense of what we'll do, we get a sense of what they will do. We're living in a region right now that you're going to have to basically find ways to work in parallel on all these issues, because if you think that you can get one done without any reference to the other, you're probably kidding yourself. So level 4 has to do with the Arab world and how it reaches out, how it invests in the Palestinians and how it reaches out to the Israelis. But there's another dimension to level 4, which is the Syrians. The Israelis and the Syrians should resume their effort at peacemaking. They've already resumed it through the Turks. Turkey has been the go-between. The Bush administration wasn't prepared to engage on this. But the fact of the matter is, this is something that is worth pursuing. I can tell you the Israeli military has been the strongest single proponent for pursuing a deal with the Syrians because they see this is the way to change the strategic landscape. They see it as a vehicle to separate the Syrians from Iran. They see it as a vehicle to separate the Syrians from Hezbollah and Hamas. Now, whether that can be achieved or not, I don't know. I listen to people, and I've heard people argue passionately that Bashar al-Assad will never do a deal with the Israelis. This is just a subterfuge. I've heard others say absolutely he needs to do a deal because his situation, the economics are so bad, he needs a deal. You know, for those who argue on each side, what I will tell you is, I don't know. But I can tell you that those who argue so passionately on each side, they don't know either. And the only way to find out is to probe it. You know, we were masters, at least with states, at not negotiating over the last 8 years. We made our reluctance to talk the issue, not their bad behavior. I'd rather have their bad behavior be the focal point internationally. In the case of the Syrians, you know, I know how we like to say on a lot of issues we don't take the military option off the table. I like to say we're not taking the diplomatic option off the table. Use it and test. You know, I can't tell you what the outcome will be. What I can tell you, if you don't test it, you create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I don't know why we would want to do that. So that's really the 4th level. And the last level has to do with the political negotiating process that has been ongoing between Israelis and Palestinians over the course of the last year. The good news is it's been serious. The bad news is nobody believes in it, at least the publics. They don't believe in it. And that's why I say you have to create a public context for negotiations so leaders who are then asked to take on core issues, narrative issues, historic issues, feel when they do it, they can gain some support. You create a foundation, you create a context so you empower leaders to make these moves. The negotiations, it's in our interest to try to preserve what's going on in those negotiations and to preserve that negotiating process. But we shouldn't treat that as the only approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We shouldn't treat those negotiations as the sum total of what peacemaking is about, because it isn't. Because you have to work on the other 4 levels. Integrate all 5 of those levels, and you actually have a chance to transform the context. Now, I've droned on for a long time, so I'm going to wrap it up. In each of the areas that I talked about Iraq, I talked about Iran, I talked about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. In all these areas, I started by saying it's a pretty daunting, not particularly wonderful story. But the truth is, as hard and as problematic as each of these areas are, if you begin to drill down, you can actually see there's something that can be done on each of them. And our task, the task of statecraft, is to focus on how can we work on all of them in a way that recognizes what's possible and builds on that possibility. Thanks very much.
Ambassador Ross has agreed to take some questions. We will take about 15 minutes and then let him go home.
Yeah. That's true. You know, it's yeah. And I guess you want me to. Look, Russia is. I didn't mention Russia on Iran, and I could have, because Russia, the truth is, if you're really constructing an approach to Iran where you want to get the Iranian attention, if you get the Chinese, you're going to get their attention because the Chinese are sort of a pivot economically. If you could get the Russians, you will also get their attention because they're on their border, and they're quite mindful of Russian behavior. The Russians have made it clear that they don't want Iran to go nuclear, but they're engaging in a posture that will allow them to go nuclear. And the question is, can you affect the Russian behavior? What I was trying to suggest was the following. I did it implicitly, now I'll make it explicit. If we could succeed in affecting the Chinese and the Europeans, and you bring the Gulf states into this the way I'm describing, which is part of the way you get the Europeans and the Chinese, you then can go to the Russians and you can say, look, you can be a part of this, or it's your choice not to be. If you had all of them, you could probably go back to the Security Council and say, let's do it through the Security Council. In effect, what you're doing with the Russians is you're not saying they're excluded. You're giving them the choice to be a part of it or not. I'm not a big believer in actively excluding the Russians, because this then plays on their psychology that we have sought to keep them weak, and we seek to sort of minimize their role, and we don't respect their prerogatives, and we don't respect who they are, and they have a certain standing. The psychological impact of loss of superpower status has been quite profound on them. And it's very clear that from a political standpoint, being anti-American right now is actually something that is very popular, and I suspect there are constituencies in the Russian leadership that see some virtue in that from a political standpoint. Now, that virtue looks one way when you have $147 a barrel oil, and it looks something rather different when you have $42 a barrel oil. So I would be quite happy to have a discussion with the Russians. I'd kind of like to line up others first, just because I come back to the leverage issue. I want to build their incentive in being responsive. I would also, you have to put some things on the table that matter to them. Now, I wrote a piece that was published in the spring where this was obviously before Georgia, where I suggested that one way to approach the Russians is to say, the reason we have focused on building a missile defense capability in the Czech Republic and in Poland is because of the threat from the Iranians. Now, if there isn't a threat from the Iranians because you helped to ensure there isn't a threat from the Iranians, well, we really don't need to build that capability. The fact that the Russians have made this a really big issue is indicated by a lot of things, not the least of which is when Medvedev made his first trip abroad, it was to China. And they made a joint statement at the joint communique at the end of the visit. And in the joint communique, there was this line against the missile defenses in the Czech Republic and Poland. Now, I can suggest to you that for the Chinese, they have this much interest in that issue. It wasn't there because of the Chinese. So the Russians have made this a big symbol. So the fact of the matter is, if there was a way to deal with that big symbol, you might be able to get something in return. It's more complicated in the aftermath of Georgia than it was before, because we've made certain commitments, and there's unease. Certainly, I think in the case of Poland and the Czech Republic, they also feel they expose themselves somewhat in terms of committing to this issue. So maybe the way you do it is not say, well, we won't proceed with it, but with the Russians you could say, look, there's no reason, if this issue is removed, then obviously it doesn't have to be deployed. And you could have, to deal with the Russians on this issue, you really have to deal with the Poles and the Czech Republic before you do that. Again, one thing about statecraft, you have to think about who are all the actors who were affected by what you're doing. You have to think that through in advance of doing it. You don't do it and say, oh yeah, gee, they care about this. This is something where when you devise a strategy, you have to consider all the various equities and have discussions in advance, and then you can try to manage it that way. But so that's, I didn't mention them, but that's how I would mention them. Yeah. Well, I mean, Turkey is this kind of very interesting bridge of a democratic country that also happens to now have a government led by an Islamic party. So here could be the reconciliation that one looks for between the Muslim states and the Western world. I think Turkey should be seen by us as a potential bridge. They want to play this role. Historically, by the way, they didn't. They wanted to be only integrated. Basically, they're part of NATO. They wanted to be completely integrated in the West. They didn't want to think about that. Now we see them having much more of an interest. First, they look at the role they're playing between Israel and Syria. Secondly, they've offered to try to be helpful in terms of discussions with the Iranians. They clearly want to play that role, and I think it's worth our exploring it with them. We have a stake in that. Yeah.
You spoke about the upcoming elections in Iraq in January. There's made no comment about the upcoming elections in Israel in February. And I'm wondering, since it appears that Netanyahu will be the victor unless Israel does something about it, what kind of leverage do you see that America has to ensure that Netanyahu is willing to stay on some sort of course to lead to a peaceful solution?
Well, first, I'm big at anticipating all sorts of things, but if there's one thing I know, predicting elections in Israel well in advance of the elections is a kind of foolhardy exercise. So I'm a little reluctant to get into figuring out who's going to be the next prime minister and what the coalition is going to look like. I would say this: whoever is the prime minister of Israel has a very strong interest in their relationship with the United States, number one. And number two, whoever is the prime minister of Israel is also still going to have to deal with a certain reality of demographics. There are demographic trends. Ariel Sharon did not withdraw from Gaza and didn't create the Kadima Party, which he did only because he was planning a disengagement from the West Bank, because suddenly he felt that he didn't like Israel being in these places. He looked at the demographics and he said, we have to change where we are, because if we don't, we won't be Jewish and democratic over time. Those demographic realities haven't changed. The trends are still there. So, the withdrawal from Gaza may buy you time, but you still have to deal with it, point one. Point two, the Palestinian Authority is basically, right now, it's in a competition with Hamas. If the Palestinian Authority doesn't make it, to quote a colleague of mine, David Makovsky, they're not going to be replaced by the Hadassah Women's Organization of Brooklyn. So, it's in the Israeli interest to help ensure that the Palestinian Authority is successful. Now, that doesn't mean that there are things they can do, and the Palestinian Authority also has to do them. But I think the point is, there's a context there. Whoever is Prime Minister of Israel is still going to face that context. He's still going to have to make decisions in light of that context. And is also going to make decisions in light of the threat from Iran. And so they're not indifferent to these issues either. What it actually means in terms of the approach, we'll have to see. But, the 5 levels that I described, I still think that they could apply. Exactly what you're doing in each of those levels may well be influenced by who the Israeli government is made up of. Yeah, all the way in the back. Or not all the way in the back, but yeah.
Before we get to the first question, what is Pakistan's role in all this? More specifically, do they have a vested interest in a non-nuclear Iran being the only nuclear power in the Middle East?
That is a really interesting question. I don't think, first of all, Pakistan and Iran have a historic relationship that is probably more competitive than cooperative. It would be interesting to see how the civilian government in Pakistan looks at Iran right now. They see, they have certain economic stakes in a good relationship with Iran. If there are going to be certain pipelines that might exist, they could run through Pakistan, and this is financially something that could be extremely important to Pakistan. Do they want Iran to be nuclear? My suspicion is they could probably restrain their enthusiasm over Iran becoming nuclear. I don't know that they have a major role to play on this, but it's hard to disaggregate the issues. And look at, when I describe Iran, I talked about Iran basically looking westward in terms of what they're doing. But Iran has a stake in what goes on in Afghanistan. And, you know, there's been a lot of disturbances among the Iranian Baluch population, which borders the Baluch population in Pakistan. So they have areas where they could have common interests that could be quite strong economically, and even in terms of what happens in Afghanistan. So I think the potential to think about an Iran that plays a role in both directions is there. And any broader negotiation with the Iranians probably has to take into account South Asia at the same time. So I guess it doesn't quite deal with the heart of your question, but I think it's I think we just have to realize that, you know, there used to, actually Anne-Marie said it when she was, it's true, when there was a time when both at the NSC and in the State Department, Near East South Asia was joined. They weren't separated. And I actually headed at the NSC in the mid-'80s the Near East South Asia office. And the tendency was always to kind of, even then, to kind of focus, well, you got India and Pakistan, Afghanistan treated separately. Well, we're not quite as capable of doing that right now because Iran has a set of equities there, has a set of interests there, can play a role there, and we're obviously going to have a stake in what happens in Afghanistan, and you can't deal with Afghanistan without reference to Pakistan. Yeah.
Is it a realistic option to consider the possibility of Israel doing something to prevent Iran's nuclear capability? Number one. And number two, I heard that at $42 a barrel oil, a facility is practically bankrupt.
Wait, who's practically bankrupt? The Saudis? Saudis are not. The Saudis, if the Saudis can balance their budget if they have oil at $50 a barrel. So at $40 a barrel, they're going to have a deficit, but they've got huge reserves, huge financial reserves. The Iranians could be practically bankrupt because depending upon which assessment you read, you know, at a minimum, what I've seen, they have to have at least $70 a barrel or they face huge deficits. I read one statistic that said already they might face a deficit of $54 billion. Now, if some of these claims about where their reserves are, they could be between $9 and $20 billion, they got a problem. I mean, Houston, you got a problem. So, you know, I'd say that it's much more the case with regard to Iran than it is to Saudi Arabia. As for the first question, look, there's no question that the Israelis look at Iran with having nuclear weapons as posing a potentially existential threat to the state of Israel. There is a leadership in Iran that's not limited only to Ahmadinejad that delegitimizes Israel, that talks about Israel disappearing, and if you have nuclear weapons, you're actually acquiring the means to try to act on those words. So, you know, to talk to leaders in Israel who you know, are in their own minds, you know, there's been one Holocaust, they aren't prepared to see another one. You know, yes, do they take it very seriously? Yes. One of the things that I think is incumbent on us is to make it clear that we are fashioning an approach that gives us a chance to prevent them from going nuclear through diplomatic means. I tried to outline to you some of the ways you could put together such a strategy for that. And the more credible we look on that, the more the Israelis, I think, will support such a diplomatic process. Look, the last thing in the world the Israelis want to do is to have to act militarily against Iran because they know there's going to be retaliation. I made a reference to 42,000 rockets in Lebanon. What do you think is going to happen if there's retaliation against Iran? Right now, you know, it turns out I didn't mention this, but Hamas, it appears now, from what I've seen, they may have as many as 10,000 rockets in Gaza right now. So the Israelis can understand what risks they might be running in the event of military action against Iran. They have to weigh those risks against the risks of Iran actually having nuclear weapons. I think right now we have some time to try to change the dynamic, but we don't have a lot of time. Okay. I'll take two more, and why don't I take them at the same time? Yeah. Okay, next one. Yeah. Well, if you, I mean, I'll take, you hear the questions? Want to hear the questions? The first question was right of return, and the second question was, what about the role of non-state actors, particularly in the Muslim world, and how they might affect any efforts at diplomacy? Let me take the second one first. Well, look, you see what's happened between India and Pakistan right now, and actually, I think Sardauri's article in the New York Times talking about the role of non-state actors trying to foment, a huge conflict and crisis. Those non-state actors have that incentive; they have that stake. So we need to come up with strategies for how to deal with the non-state actors wherever they are. My own view is that these non-state actors who are basically radical Islamists, we cannot discredit them from the outside. We don't have the means to do that. They can only be discredited from within. And the challenge is going to be, how do we identify our natural partners who are competing with them, and they're competing with them not because we want them to compete with them. They're competing with them because it's their own future, it's their own salvation. I'll give you an example. I've been working with 58 NGOs, Palestinian NGOs in the West Bank, all grassroots organizations. And the whole focal point has been how to help them to become more effective. I didn't create them. I didn't create their incentives. I've just been trying to work with them to create greater exposure for them and to create greater investment in them so that they could actually begin to deliver services, so they could compete at the local levels with Hamas. I think a lot of what we have to do is we have to find ways to help build the credibility of reformers. We have to find ways to help governments and regimes to become more effective in terms of their own delivery of services. We have to do this. We have to frame what we do in a way that is also acceptable to them. We should talk with them and listen to them about the kinds of things we do that are helpful to them, the kinds of things we could do that aren't helpful to them. But the longer-term answer to this is to find ways to discredit them from within. In some cases, look, those who are the most violent, you're going to have to use violence to defeat them. But when you're dealing with the Iranians, or you're dealing with Hamas, or you're dealing with Hezbollah, you're dealing with those who also have a social political agenda that they use to build their appeal. You have to compete with them at the same time. Right of return, look, the right of return is something that Palestinians talk about. The refugee issue is what you have to solve. If you're going to solve the refugee issue in a way that ends Israel as being a Jewish state, you're not going to solve it. So if you're talking about a two-state solution, the refugee issue has to be managed in a way that ensures an outcome that the refugees are not going back to Israel in a way, or in any way perhaps. I mean, if you look at the Israeli position is they don't go back at all. Palestinian position is they want the issue to be managed in some way. When we were with the Clinton ideas, what we did in the year 2000 is we came up with a proposal which was Palestinians have a right of return to their state, they don't have a right of return to Israel. We came up, we had the idea of a $30 billion package for compensation for those who chose not to return or for resettlement or repatriation purposes. We talked about third countries they might go to. We talked about third countries or the U.S. Or Israel they would have the sovereignty to determine who they let in. But the refugee, I'm not going to try to negotiate the issue right now, but I would simply say the refugee issue has to have an outcome that is consistent with a two-state solution. The two-state solution being the Palestinian state and the Jewish state of Israel. Thank you.
So as I was listening to Ambassador Ross, I found myself thinking the world may be flat, as somebody else argues. I don't know whether it's flat or not, but what I do know is it's very complicated. And listening to Ambassador Ross, I thought it's a good thing that we are once again hearing about all the complexities of these issues. That doesn't make them easier, but it is a far more accurate depiction of what the world actually looks like out there, and recognizing that is the first step toward developing strategies to solve it. So we're delighted to have had you, and we hope you'll come back.